At the height of his power, Lucky Luciano seemed untouchable. He walked through New York City like a man who owned every shadow, every whisper, every dollar that moved through the underworld. His name carried weight heavier than bullets. His decisions shaped the destiny of entire neighborhoods. Politicians feared him, gangsters respected him, and enemies disappeared before they ever saw his face. To the outside world, Luciano was the king of organized crime, a man without weakness, without doubt, without fear. But that illusion, like all illusions, hid a deeper truth. For behind the tailored suits, behind the confident stare and the effortless authority, there lived a fear far more powerful than any rival. It was not fear of death. Luciano had survived too many ambushes to care about dying. It was not fear of prison. He had grown up in the streets and cages did not intimidate him. And it certainly was not fear of other men. He had outsmarted tyrants, silenced traitors, and reshaped the criminal landscape with a vision none of his contemporaries possessed. No, the fear that haunted Lucky Luciano was quieter, sharper, and far more personal. He feared losing control. Control had carried him from the grim alleys of the Lower East Side to the throne of America's criminal empire. Control had allowed him to tame the chaos of gang wars, to unite feuding families, to build the commission, and to stand at the center of a web so vast even law enforcement struggled to grasp it. Control was his greatest weapon, and the one thing he could never afford to lose. Yet this story is not about how Luciano gained power. It is about how he held it, how he tried to protect it, and how it slowly slipped through his fingers. It is the story of a man who believed he could outthink human nature, only to discover that fear, ambition, and betrayal could topple even the strongest mind. This is not the rise of a king, it is the unraveling of a godfather. At the height of his reign, Luciano understood better than anyone that power did not come from violence alone. It came from perception. It came from alliances. It came from convincing dangerous men that obeying him was safer than defying him. He mastered the art of influence, reading intentions, predicting betrayal, shaping decisions long before they were made. He walked the world like a chessboard, always 3 moves ahead. But the irony of power is that the higher a man climbs, the more fragile his balance becomes. For every ally Luciano trusted, there was another waiting to betray him. For every victory he engineered, there was a consequence forming in the background. Even his closest advisors, Lansky, Costello, Siegel, knew that the underworld was a place where loyalty had to be earned daily, and where fear could change a man's heart in a single night. Luciano built an empire designed to survive anything, except the one adversary he could never defeat, the inevitable unraveling of control. This story, then, is not simply a biography. It is a study in power, how it is gained, how it is wielded, and how it breaks the men who cling to it. Luciano's fall didn't begin with an assassination attempt or a police raid. It began with small cracks, whispered doubts, shifting alliances, unpredictable loyalties. It began with the fear he never spoke aloud but always sensed around him. A fear that one mistake, one betrayal, one unexpected move could cause everything he built to collapse. For in Luciano's world, power was a living creature, fierce, hungry, and always watching. The moment a leader stopped feeding it with strategy, respect, and strength, it turned on him. Luciano knew this better than anyone, which made his downfall all the more tragic. He didn't fall because he grew weak. He fell because power itself, like every empire, has a natural ending. The emotional stakes of this story are not in the bullets fired or the deals struck. They lie in the internal war of a man who tried to control the uncontrollable. They lie in the fear he carried alone, the betrayal he never saw coming, and the realization that even the greatest mastermind cannot escape the consequences of his own creation. This book begins not with a coronation, but with a question. What terrifies the most feared man in the underworld? The answer is simple. The fear that the kingdom he built from shadows could vanish in daylight. The fear that loyalty could change in an instant. The fear that the men he elevated could one day decide he no longer deserved the throne. The fear that power, his greatest triumph, would become the very force that destroyed him. As we step into Luciano's world, we step into a story not of glory, but of inevitability. A story of a king who ruled through brilliance and charisma, yet could not escape the fate shared by all-powerful men. The fall of Lucky Luciano did not begin with bullets. It began with fear. And it ended with betrayal. Before Lucky Luciano reshaped the underworld into a functioning empire, New York City was a battlefield without rules, a chaotic arena where power changed hands through blood, betrayal, and raw instinct. There was no king, no commission, no structured hierarchy. There were only gangs, ethnic, territorial, volatile, each fighting for survival in a city overflowing with ambition and desperation. It was a world that devoured the weak and exhausted the strong. And it was this fractured landscape that set the stage for Luciano's rise. In the early 1900s, New York's immigrant neighborhoods formed the perfect breeding ground for disorder. The Lower East Side swarmed with Italian street crews, Irish toughs, Jewish racketeers, and independent hustlers who lived day to day, dollar to dollar. Violence was not a last resort, it was language. Disputes were settled with fists, knives, or bullets. Loyalty shifted overnight, and alliances dissolved as quickly as they formed. No one stayed on top for long. The Italian underworld, in particular, mirrored the old country feuds Luciano had left behind as a child. Sicilian bosses clung to traditions that emphasized loyalty and blood ties, but these principles meant little in the chaos of American streets. Instead of unity, old-world customs created fragmentation. Families battled families. Factions within those families battled each other. Honor meant something different to every man who claimed it. Silence did not guarantee safety. Assassination often followed obedience as quickly as defiance. Into this already volatile environment came the Irish gangs, whose control over politics and police networks gave them a power the Sicilians envied but could not counter effectively. The Irish dominated the docks, the unions, and the Tammany Hall machine, blending criminal enterprise with city governance. Their grip on political influence made them formidable, but their willingness to resort to brute force ensured constant conflict with rivals. They were kings of their corners, yet prisoners of their own limited vision. Then there were the Jewish gangs, sharp and fast evolving, shaped by immigrant struggle and entrepreneurial instinct. They embraced innovation where the Sicilians clung to tradition. These crews were unpredictable, unbound by rigid codes, and adept at forming alliances of convenience. Their adaptability often placed them at odds with more conservative factions. They were not guided by ancient rituals or tribal pride, they were guided by profit. These ethnic divisions transformed New York into a city carved into unstable territories. The streets functioned like shifting battle lines, constantly contested, constantly redrawn. Bloodshed was routine, and the death of one leader often ignited a new cycle of war. No gang possessed enough unity to dominate the others. No boss had enough authority to enforce lasting peace. Power in this world was temporary by design. Prohibition, introduced in 1920, poured gasoline on an already raging fire. Suddenly, the underworld had access to unimaginable wealth. Liquor profits dwarfed anything traditional rackets could produce. Every criminal group, from the most disciplined family to the smallest street gang, wanted a piece of the business. But prohibition also magnified the existing fractures. Smuggling routes needed protection. Breweries needed territory. Distribution required cooperation. Instead, rival groups hijacked each other's shipments, murdered competitors, and sabotaged operations. The old rules of the Sicilian way could not contain the new stakes. Tradition demanded honor, prohibition demanded organization. And no one had it. Bosses who tried to impose order quickly found themselves overwhelmed by the scale of opportunity. They lacked the foresight to build lasting alliances, and they lacked the imagination to integrate outsiders into their operations. The Irish had political reach but not enough cultural influence to command the Italians. The Jews had networks but not enough manpower to dominate the streets. The Italians had heritage but not enough unification to prevent internal collapse. This was a world that rewarded violence over vision, short-term gain over long-term strategy. Every man fought for himself, every gang defended its turf with paranoia, and every victory only intensified the next threat. The underworld was profitable, but unsustainable. It was powerful but fractured. It was fierce but directionless. And in the center of this storm were the early gang leaders, men like Joe Masuria, whose crude strength allowed him to gather soldiers but never to govern them, and Salvatore Maranzano, whose old-world elegance could not survive new-world brutality. Their leadership styles clashed violently, igniting feuds that spilled across the city. The Castellammarese War, though still years away, was already seated in the tension between men who lacked the ability to shape the evolving criminal landscape. In this unstable world, every boss lived with the knowledge that he could be replaced at any moment, by a bullet, a betrayal, or a more ambitious rival. There was no system to prevent chaos, no central authority to resolve disputes, no strategic vision to unify competing factions. The underworld was not a kingdom. It was a mosaic of grudges. This is the world into which Lucky Luciano stepped. A world where no single leader possessed both the intellect and the adaptability required to bring order to disorder. Luciano watched, listened, studied. He saw that the old Sicilian traditions could not survive America's hunger for opportunity. He saw that violence alone could not sustain power. He saw that the streets were overflowing with money, but no one had the structure to manage it efficiently. Where others saw chaos, Luciano saw potential. Where others fought for survival, Luciano planned for dominance. Where others clung to honor, Luciano pursued control. His rise mattered because he offered what the underworld had never known: a system, a structure, a governing body that could transform gangs into families and families into a syndicate. Before the king came order, but before the order came chaos. And only a visionary born from that chaos could learn how to rule it. Long before Lucky Luciano became the architect of American organized crime, he was simply Salvatore Lucania, a boy fighting to survive in the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side. Hunger shaped him before ambition ever could. The immigrant struggle was not a poetic hardship, it was a daily war. Families crammed into airless rooms, children scavenged for coins, and every block carried the scent of sweat, refuse, and desperation. Luciano arrived in New York believing opportunity awaited him, but what he found instead was a world that rewarded only those willing to seize what others guarded. As a young boy, Luciano learned quickly that weakness attracted danger. Schoolyard fights erupted over accents, clothing, or the simple fact of being Italian. Bigger boys singled him out, mocking his name, his voice, his patched-up clothes. But each fight, each shove into grimy pavement hardened him. He began studying people. The twitch of a bully's jaw before he swung, the bluff behind a threat, the difference between loud confidence and true danger. Violence became a language, and Luciano learned to speak it fluently. His transformation from frightened child to fearless street kid was gradual but inevitable. Pain taught him resilience. Poverty taught him hunger. And hunger taught him ambition. He realized survival was not enough. Not in a world where the strong controlled everything worth having. Somewhere between bruised knuckles and empty pockets, he discovered a truth that would define his destiny. Power belonged to those who understood people, not those who simply feared them. His earliest hustles were small, selling hats, rolling dice, carrying goods for merchants. But each job introduced him to the unpredictable nature of trust. Some men cheated him, some encouraged him, and some tried to use him. Luciano observed it all, learning which faces lied easily and which eyes stayed steady under pressure. By the time he reached his teenage years, he was no longer a boy reacting to danger. He was a young man calculating it. Then came the meeting that changed everything. One afternoon, Luciano watched a much larger boy threaten a scrawny Jewish kid over a few pennies. Before the bully could strike, the boy, quiet, composed, shockingly calm, stood his ground without flinching. Luciano admired the nerve instantly. The boy was Meyer Lansky, and in that moment the foundation of a lifelong partnership was set. Their friendship grew on mutual recognition. Lansky possessed sharp intelligence and emotional control. Luciano possessed instinct and charisma. They understood each other's strengths without needing to speak them aloud. Lansky taught Luciano discipline in thought, while Luciano taught Lansky timing in action. Together they analyzed the street the way older men studied business. While others drifted from fight to fight, the two boys treated survival like strategy. The second pivotal bond formed when Lansky introduced Luciano to Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Siegel was everything Luciano wasn't: explosive, fearless, and unpredictable, but his loyalty was absolute once earned. If Lansky represented calculation, Siegel represented force. Luciano immediately recognized the potential: the mind, the muscle, and the mediator. Three boys who understood power differently, yet shared an instinct for rising above their circumstances. Together, they formed a psychological triangle that shaped Luciano's future. From Lansky he learned to navigate problems with clarity rather than rage. From Siegel he learned when violence was necessary and when hesitation meant death. And from both he learned an invaluable truth: the right allies were more powerful than any weapon. But these friendships also sparked Luciano's deepest fear, one that would follow him for the rest of his life: the fear of losing the very people who made him strong. On the streets, betrayals were constant. Boys switched sides during fights, partners stole from their own crews, and men died because someone they trusted wanted a better deal. Luciano saw it all. He watched friendships dissolve over dollars, watched alliances crumble because of greed, watched loyalty vanish the moment consequences grew too heavy. These experiences carved into him a belief that shaped his entire rise: choosing allies wisely was vital, but keeping them loyal mattered even more. As he entered adulthood, Luciano expanded into gambling, protection rackets, and small-time bootlegging. He built crews not by fear alone but by understanding the desires and insecurities of the men around him. He learned who wanted money, who wanted respect, who wanted safety, and who simply wanted someone to recognize their worth. He gave each man what he needed, just enough to bind them to him, never enough for them to feel independent. He also began separating temporary allies from essential ones. The temporary men were tools. Lansky and Siegel were brothers. With them he could plan for something greater than street hustling. He could envision a world where power wasn't determined by brawls but by structure. A world where the chaos of New York's underworld could be shaped, directed, mastered. Even as a rising young gangster, Luciano sensed destiny forming around him, not because he believed he was chosen for greatness, but because he saw the underworld more clearly than anyone his age. He saw the gaps between the ethnic gangs, the absence of order, the inefficiency of constant war. He saw that nothing lasting could be built on chaos. And he saw, more importantly, that he could be the one to fix it. But ambition always came with fear. Luciano feared failing, feared misreading a man's intentions, feared losing Lansky and Siegel to violence, envy, or opportunity. Power meant nothing if built alone. And he had no desire to rule a kingdom without trust at its core. The boy who once fought to survive schoolyard bullies had evolved into a young man who fought to master the currents of loyalty and dangers swirling around him. His hunger had turned into purpose. His bruises had turned into lessons. His friendships had turned into destiny. This was the beginning of Lucky Luciano, not the king, not the architect, not the godfather, but the street kid who learned the first and most unforgiving rule of power: choose your allies wisely, and fear losing them even more. Lucky Luciano did not rise through the underworld by accident or brute strength alone. He rose because he saw what no one else could see, that crime, like any business, demanded structure. That power to survive needed strategy. And that the chaos suffocating New York's criminal world was not a threat, but an opportunity. He saw a broken landscape, and imagined an empire. By his early 20s, Luciano had already evolved from a street kid into a respected enforcer. He had a sharp mind, a steady temperament, and the rare ability to inspire loyalty without begging for it. But he also possessed something far more dangerous: the instinct to adapt. Where others were trapped in old-world thinking, Luciano embraced the future. He understood that the criminal world was changing, whether the Sicilian bosses wanted it to or not. Throughout the 1920s, Prohibition flooded New York with cash. Bootlegging became the most profitable racket in American history, and every gang wanted control. But chaos ruled the industry: hijackings, double-crosses, street wars. No one trusted anyone. No one planned ahead. No one built anything sustainable. The money was enormous, but the instability was fatal. Luciano recognized that the future belonged not to the strongest, but to the most organized. He began forging alliances not based on heritage or emotion, but on efficiency. His closest confidants, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, formed the psychological backbone of his rise. Lansky provided clarity, analysis, and financial brilliance. Siegel provided muscle, audacity, and absolute loyalty. Luciano respected them because they represented the two halves of power: the mind and the fist. And together they envisioned something larger than street rackets. Their first major step toward reshaping crime was professionalization. Luciano insisted that operations be treated like legitimate businesses. He implemented accounting systems, streamlined supply chains, and reduced violence that drew unnecessary law enforcement attention. Violence was no longer impulsive. It became a strategic tool. Money was no longer counted in back rooms, it was tracked like dividends. Luciano's empire grew not because it was feared, but because it was efficient. His next step was diversification. The old bosses focused on one racket at a time: gambling, extortion, numbers. Luciano expanded everywhere. Bootlegging, prostitution, narcotics smuggling, labor racketeering, protection schemes. He built revenue streams that connected and supported each other. If one business slowed, another surged. If police cracked down on one area, the others continued operating. For the first time, the mafia functioned as an integrated system rather than fractured clans. But business alone could not secure power. Luciano understood the psychology of dangerous men. He studied ambition like a map. He learned what every ally wanted, what every rival feared, and how far each man would go to protect his interests. He rewarded loyalty generously, but never blindly. He punished betrayal decisively, but never wastefully. He knew every man had a breaking point, and he used incentives to ensure they never reached it. This careful balance built not just an empire but a following. And following is what made him dangerous. As Luciano's influence grew, the old world dons began to see him as a threat. Joe, the boss, Masuria ruled through intimidation and tradition. Salvatore Maranzano ruled through elegance and Sicilian hierarchy. Both believed leadership belonged only to men born in the old country. Both underestimated the ambition of a young immigrant who saw farther than they could. Luciano understood that the mafia could not survive endless wars. The Castellamarese tensions brewing beneath the surface were threatening to ignite. And so, he began quietly recruiting younger men frustrated with the stagnation of old-world rules. He gathered thinkers, fighters, earners, men willing to risk tradition for progress. Some joined him out of admiration. Others joined because they sensed the winds of change. All joined because Luciano gave them something Masuria and Maranzano could not, a vision beyond the streets. But every step toward power came with a price. As Luciano's alliances expanded, so did his fear, not fear of rivals but fear of losing control. He had seen countless bosses undone by betrayal from within. He knew the stronger he became, the more tempting it would be for someone close to him to seize what he built. Power required trust, but trust was the most dangerous currency in the underworld. Still he pushed forward. His most radical restructuring came when he realized that the mafia's future depended on organization across families, not within them. He imagined a syndicate where violence was regulated, disputes were mediated and profit was shared, not because men liked each other but because it benefited everyone. It was a revolutionary idea born not from tradition but from necessity. With Lansky's analytical support and Siegel's fearlessness, Luciano began quietly reshaping alliances between Italians, Jews and Irish crews. He negotiated access to unions, established shared territories, and created cooperative agreements that cut unnecessary bloodshed. He believed cooperation, not isolation, was the key to surviving prohibition and whatever came after it. The old bosses called him reckless, radical, dangerous. But behind their criticism lay fear that a new generation was rising not by brute force but by intellect. Luciano's ascent was not a smooth climb, it was a battlefield disguised as progress. Every alliance he formed threatened another. Every innovation he introduced challenged long-standing customs. And every victory deepened the anxiety that lived inside him. The knowledge that men admired him, depended on him, and would eventually envy him. He could feel it, like a shadow just behind him, the ever-present danger that his own empire would someday turn against him. Yet Luciano pressed forward because he believed in what he was building. He believed the mafia could become something greater than street violence. He believed structure could tame chaos. He believed alliances could replace vendettas. And he believed he could control the very forces that had destroyed every boss before him. This belief would become both his triumph and his doom. The empire he built rose from vision, intelligence, and the hunger of a man who refused to be limited by heritage or circumstance. But as the walls of his power expanded, so did the cracks beneath them. The stronger Luciano's system became, the more dangerous its potential to collapse. For in building an empire designed to control dangerous men, Luciano had unknowingly created something more dangerous still, a world where those men no longer needed him. And his greatest fear, the loss of control, began quietly forming in the shadows of his greatest achievement. Long before Lucky Luciano rose to power, long before he reshaped the mafia into a modern syndicate, one rule governed the underworld with absolute authority: omerta. It was more than silence. It was more than obedience. It was a sacred bond, an unwritten scripture that dictated how a man lived, suffered, and died. Omerta promised security through secrecy, honor through loyalty, and identity through allegiance. But beneath its noble aura lay something darker, something heavier, the psychological weight of carrying a code that could destroy a man the moment he failed it. To the old Sicilian bosses, omerta was holy. It came from generations of fear and survival, forged in villages where law could not be trusted and betrayal was punished with blood. Silence was not a choice, it was the price of belonging. Loyalty was not negotiated, it was inherited. Men followed omerta because tradition demanded it, because their fathers followed it, because their grandfathers had died upholding it. But Luciano, raised in the streets of New York rather than the hills of Sicily, saw omerta with different eyes. As a young gangster he respected the code, he understood its power, its symbolism, its necessity. But he also saw its weaknesses. Blind loyalty made men predictable. Rigid silence made them vulnerable. Tradition made them enemies of progress. In a world changing as fast as America, Luciano believed the code had to evolve or it would shatter under the weight of its own inflexibility. So he embraced omerta, but reinterpreted it. For him, Omerta was not simply a vow of silence. It was a psychological contract, a strategic agreement, a mutual promise built not on fear alone, but on shared interest and benefit. Loyalty in Luciano's mind should not be unconditional. It should be earned, reinforced, rewarded, because men were not saints, they were human. They followed whoever protected their futures, not whoever preached about honor. This shift made Luciano dangerous. He weaponized the code in ways old bosses never imagined. Instead of demanding devotion, he built it. Instead of punishing betrayal with unthinking brutality, he created environments where betrayal was unlikely. Instead of expecting loyalty because of tradition, he constructed loyalty through design. But even as Luciano reshaped Omerta to suit his vision, he carried the weight of it like a stone tied to his heart. Because for Luciano, Omerta was not just a rule, it was an identity. It was who he believed he needed to be. Silence was strength. Loyalty was survival. And to lose either meant losing himself. The emotional cost of the code revealed itself early in his rise. Luciano watched soldiers die because they refused to speak, even when speaking would have saved them. He watched families bury loved ones who upheld Omerta to the end, convinced that breaking the code was worse than death. He felt the fear in young men's eyes when they swore their oath, knowing they were binding themselves to something deeper than brotherhood. And he saw the devastation when the code was broken, even once. Betrayal was not simply a violation, it was a spiritual wound. A rupture. A tearing apart of the world the mafia built. Luciano carried these memories with him as he ascended the ranks. They shaped his belief that Omerta had to be both feared and understood, honored and managed. So he created systems of incentives, money, opportunity, protection, that made loyalty profitable. He built relationships based on respect rather than terror. He studied human nature and designed a world where the code did not feel like a burden, but a pathway to power. Yet deep down, Luciano knew the truth. Omerta was always fragile. Always conditional. Always one fear, one temptation, one moment of desperation away from breaking. And that terrified him. Because Luciano's greatest fear was not death, nor prison, nor rivals. It was losing control. And control depended entirely on loyalty. If Omerta cracked, even slightly, everything he built would crumble faster than it rose. This fear followed him into every meeting, every negotiation, every alliance. He examined men not for their strength but for the potential cracks in their loyalty. Was this man ruled by greed? By fear? By pride? Could he resist pressure? Could he carry secrets to his grave? Luciano's brilliance lay not just in identifying who could be trusted, but in engineering conditions where trust became the logical choice. Still, the emotional weight of Omerta never left him. Every betrayal, large or small, cut him deeply. When soldiers broke the code under Dewey's prosecution, testifying in exchange for lighter sentences, it was not the legal consequences that haunted Luciano. It was the realization that men he believed he controlled had chosen themselves over him. Omerta had shattered, and with it, part of Luciano's belief in the system he created. Perhaps the greatest paradox of Luciano's life was that he strengthened Omerta even as he feared it. He enforced it ruthlessly because he understood its fragility. He protected it because he knew betrayal would destroy him. And he reimagined it because he recognized that blind devotion had no place in a world driven by ambition. The cost was immense. Luciano lived constantly between two identities, the architect who redesigned loyalty and the prisoner of the very code he reshaped. He needed Omerta to survive, yet he feared the unpredictable hearts of the men who swore it. He depended on loyalty yet never fully trusted it. He demanded silence, yet knew silence could be bought or broken. For Luciano, Omerta was not simply a rule of the mafia. It was the mirror he stared into every day. A mirror that reflected both his brilliance and his vulnerability. Both his empire and his inevitable downfall. Because power built on loyalty requires absolute faith, and Luciano lived in a world where faith could turn to fear in an instant. Omerta made him powerful. Omerta made him king. Omerta made him untouchable. But Omerta also made him human, and in the end, it was the cracks in that sacred, heavy code that revealed the cost of being Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano did not just rule the underworld, he redesigned it. Before him, criminal rackets in New York were chaotic side hustles run by men who relied on muscle more than method. Gambling was scattered, prostitution was disorganized, narcotics were opportunistic, and labor influence was crude. But Luciano looked at the same world that others feared and saw something else entirely. A business. A sprawling, untapped network of profit that could be organized, streamlined, and monetized with corporate precision. He understood something no other boss fully grasped. crime could be industrialized. The underworld didn't need louder guns or tougher soldiers. It needed efficiency. It needed structure. It needed direction. And Luciano became the man willing to transform scattered rackets into a unified economic engine. Prostitution. From chaos to coordination, the prostitution racket was the first empire Luciano reorganized. Before him, brothels operated independently, often run by madams who paid off local cops and prayed rival gangs wouldn't burn their establishments down. Extortion, unpredictability, and violence plagued the industry. Luciano saw the inefficiency immediately. He implemented layers. Collectors. Enforcers. Managers. A hierarchy as clear as any legitimate business. Madams no longer negotiated alone, they became part of a network. Payments flowed upward, protection flowed downward. Violence became selective, used only when necessary to enforce order rather than create fear. The result was staggering. Profits doubled, then tripled. And in that growth, Luciano discovered something deeper. Organization gave him power far beyond money. Because when people depend on your system, they fear its collapse more than they fear you. Gambling, predictable profit in an unpredictable world. Gambling was already a cash-heavy market before Luciano stepped in, but it was fractured. Bookmakers set their own odds. Casinos operated with inconsistent rules. Protection payments varied wildly, and double crosses were so common that most profits leaked through the fingers of those who earned them. Luciano imposed consistency. He standardized odds. He regulated payouts. He assigned territories. And with Lansky's mathematical insight, gambling operations ran smoother than many legitimate Wall Street enterprises. Luciano didn't just want profit, he wanted predictability, something the underworld had never known. And the more predictable the system became, the more reliant the men within it grew. Their fortunes no longer depended on luck or violence, but on Luciano's structure, a structure they dared not disrupt. Narcotics. The Forbidden Empire. While some old bosses refused to touch narcotics out of fear or moral posturing, Luciano saw only opportunity. America's appetite for heroin and cocaine was rising, and the profits dwarfed all other rackets. But narcotics required precision. Smuggling routes, packaging networks, distributors, and layers of insulation between leadership and street-level risk. Luciano built that machine. International suppliers fed product through carefully maintained channels. Mid-level distributors handled processing and movement. Street crews managed sales in dense immigrant neighborhoods. Each layer understood only its own task, never the full picture. This compartmentalization protected Luciano from exposure, but it also revealed his greatest fear. If one layer collapsed, the entire system could fall with it. Narcotics brought immense power, but also immense vulnerability. Luciano became obsessed with preventing cracks, ensuring loyalty, stability, and silence. He knew this empire depended entirely on control, and the thought of losing that control haunted him. Labor unions. Power without bullets. Perhaps Luciano's greatest innovation came through the labor unions. The docks, trucking lines, and construction sites were arteries feeding the entire city. Whoever controlled those arteries controlled commerce itself. Previous bosses had tried to skim from unions, but none understood their full potential. Luciano did. He placed trusted lieutenants inside key locals, men who could negotiate contracts, call strikes, and influence votes. With these positions came leverage that extended far beyond traditional crime. Companies paid for labor peace. Politicians paid for election support. Rival gangs paid to avoid having their shipments disappear into the waterfront abyss. Labor control gave Luciano something money alone never could: legitimacy in disguise. And it taught him the most frightening truth about power: once you taste this level of influence, the idea of losing it becomes unbearable. The architecture of an empire. Each racket Luciano built fed the next. Gambling financed bribes. Bribes protected narcotics shipments. Narcotics money paid for influence in unions. Union leverage protected brothels and casinos. Everything was interconnected, like gears in a machine only Luciano fully understood. This multi-layered structure became the backbone of modern organized crime. It allowed the mafia to transition from street thuggery to national enterprise. It made violence strategic instead of impulsive. It turned criminals into businessmen and businessmen into allies. But every expansion, every innovation, every new revenue stream added weight to Luciano's empire, and increased the pressure inside his mind. Because with every new layer of structure came a new point of potential failure. With every ally he empowered came a new potential traitor. With every dollar earned came the fear of losing 10 more. Power gained, and the fear that followed. Luciano had built something extraordinary, something no gangster before him had achieved. He reinvented crime. He professionalized it. He made it scalable. And he became the central pillar holding up the entire architecture of the American underworld. But in doing so, he also built the source of his greatest terror. The system could live without him. He had designed efficiency so perfect that others could follow it. He had created layers so stable that others could manage them. He had empowered lieutenants so competent that they could govern in his absence, or against him. Control, the thing he feared losing most, was slipping even as his empire expanded. Luciano knew power was no longer just about who held the gun or who made the threats. Power was now the system. And systems evolve whether their creators want them to or not. So while the world saw a king rising, Luciano felt something else beneath the surface. A quiet dread that the empire he built so brilliantly might one day turn on him or worse, continue without him. In the business of crime he had achieved the impossible. And in that achievement, he had unknowingly created the seeds of his greatest downfall. In the violent, shifting world of organized crime, power was never earned alone. Lucky Luciano's rise was shaped not just by his own brilliance, but by the men orbiting him. Some allies, some enemies, some both at once. Each figure he encountered sharpened him, tested him, and pushed him closer to the throne he ultimately claimed. But every alliance carried a price, and every rival revealed a truth he could never forget. Power is fragile because men are unpredictable. Masuria, the tyrant he outgrew Joe, the boss, Masuria ruled the early underworld with brute strength and paranoia. He was the embodiment of the old world. Suspicious, violent, territorial, and convinced that tradition was more powerful than strategy. To Masuria, leadership meant domination. Loyalty meant fear. Progress meant betrayal. When Luciano joined his crew, he played the role Masuria demanded. Obedient soldier, trusted ear, respectful young man who understood his place. But Luciano learned more from Masuria's flaws than from his commands. He watched the old Don destroy alliances through arrogance, provoke conflicts out of pride, and misread every signal from the changing streets. The world was evolving, but Masuria was not. His rule was a cage, and every day Luciano spent inside it taught him that survival required more than strength. It required vision. Luciano realized he could never rise under Masuria. He could only wait for the inevitable moment when Masuria's paranoia turned toward him. And so, loyalty became performance. Respect became strategy. Luciano studied the tyrant not to serve him, but to understand how not to become him. The day he chose to betray Masuria was not a betrayal of a man, it was a rejection of a dying era. And in killing the king he had once served, Luciano took his first step toward becoming something new. Maranzano, the last Old World emperor. If Masuria represented brute force, Salvatore Maranzano represented calculated ambition. Elegant, intelligent, and disciplined, Maranzano envisioned himself as a Caesar of the underworld. He reorganized crews with military precision, recited Roman history, and demanded a kind of reverence that bordered on worship. At first, Luciano admired him. Here was a man who understood order, structure, hierarchy, all the things the mafia desperately needed. Under Maranzano, Luciano saw glimpses of the future he wanted. A world where power flowed through organization, not chaos. But admiration quickly evolved into caution. Maranzano did not see Luciano as a partner. He saw him as a tool. A talented young commander who needed to be kept close, and kept under control. As Maranzano solidified his power, he tightened his grip on everyone below him. He reorganized crews, demanded tribute, and began compiling lists of threats. Luciano soon learned he was on one of those lists. Maranzano, like Masuria before him, believed absolute loyalty required absolute dominance. But Luciano understood something his predecessors never grasped. Power enforced through fear cannot last. Men will follow you only until they find someone smarter, or until they realize you're afraid of them. So Luciano made his choice. Just as he had done with Masuria, he eliminated a king who had mistaken fear for authority. With Maranzano's death, the old world rule of boss of bosses died as well. In its place, Luciano would build something far more stable. A cooperative syndicate where no single man held unchecked power. But overthrowing tyrants taught him a darker truth. The closer he came to the throne, the more enemies he created. Dutch Schultz, the reckless storm he refused to unleash. Unlike the Sicilian bosses, Dutch Schultz was not bound by tradition. He was wild, brilliant in flashes, and dangerously unpredictable. His empire in bootlegging and numbers rackets grew quickly, but his temper grew faster. He was the kind of man who believed violence solved every problem, even when violence created bigger ones. Schultz's recklessness forced Luciano into one of the greatest decisions of his career. When Schultz announced plans to assassinate Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor targeting the mob, Luciano understood the stakes instantly. Killing Dewey would ignite a war with the government that no criminal syndicate could survive. Schultz didn't care. Luciano did. Stopping him meant choosing between alliance and annihilation. Luciano ordered Schultz's death not because he feared the man, but because he feared the consequences of empowering him. A storm like Schultz could not be controlled. And Luciano's empire depended on control. In eliminating him, Luciano demonstrated his greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability. He could predict threats. He could neutralize threats. But he could never eliminate the chaos that produced men like Schultz. Vito Genovese, the shadow waiting to strike if Schultz was reckless fire, Vito Genovese was cold steel. He was cunning, patient, and driven by a hunger for power that matched Luciano's own. He served under Luciano with outward loyalty, but behind every gesture lay calculation. Genovese understood Luciano's system because he intended to one day inherit it. Their relationship was a ticking clock. Luciano relied on Genovese's competence, but never fully trusted him. Genovese admired Luciano's vision, but envied the throne he built. When Luciano rose higher, Genovese followed. When Luciano expanded, Genovese positioned himself to benefit. He was the perfect lieutenant, until the moment he no longer wanted to be a lieutenant. Luciano always feared betrayal, but Genovese was the first man he feared specifically. Because Genovese wasn't a tyrant like Masuria or Maranzano. He was one of Luciano's own, the kind of enemy only success creates. And as Luciano's empire grew, so did Genovese's ambition. The price of the throne. Each man shaped Luciano's path. Each man pushed him closer to the top. Each man revealed another fracture in the foundation of power. Masuria taught him that strength without vision collapses. Maranzano taught him that ambition without trust suffocates. Schultz taught him that recklessness destroys empires. Genovese taught him that the greatest threat always comes from within. These lessons elevated Luciano, but they also deepened his fear. Because every step upward sharpened the shadow beneath him. And every rival he defeated reminded him of the truth he carried alone. Power is not measured by how many enemies you conquer, but by how many allies could become enemies the moment you slip. For most of his rise, Lucky Luciano carried himself with the calm certainty of a man who believed he understood every angle. He walked into rooms already knowing who could be bought, who could be threatened, and who was merely pretending to matter. His quiet confidence made him seem invincible, as though he had mastered every moving piece of the underworld. But beneath that confidence, something else stirred, a quiet fear he never admitted. Because even as Luciano rose to become the most powerful mobster in America, forces far beyond his reach had begun moving against him. Power, he would learn, could be claimed, built, even enforced, but never fully controlled. The first cracks appeared inside his own world. After the fall of Masuria and Maranzano, Luciano believed he had ended the era of senseless violence. He imagined a future where structure replaced chaos, where disputes were settled through negotiation instead of bloodshed, and where the commission would keep every boss in line. But the underworld was not a machine, it was a living creature with instincts of its own. Ambition never slept. Envy never died. And the very men Luciano elevated were beginning to test the boundaries of his new order. Some questioned his alliances with Jewish partners. Others resented the authority he held over multifamily decisions. Their silence in meetings was respectful, their hallway whispers were not. Then came the assassination attempts. They arrived not from outside enemies, but from men who wanted shortcuts to power. One crew ambushed him outside the Waldorf. Another tried poisoning him through a trusted intermediary. Luciano survived each attempt with the same unnerving composure, but internally the truth pressed harder. Control did not eliminate danger. It merely postponed it. Every attempt on his life reminded him that the throne he fought for was a chair surrounded by shadows. And shadows never stayed still. Luciano had predicted betrayals his whole life, but now they came faster, more subtly, and from men he had personally empowered. Each attack whispered the same warning. No structure can stop a man who believes he deserves your crown. But the deadliest war Luciano faced did not come from mob families, it came from the government. His empire, once invisible to law enforcement, was now unmistakable. Newspapers began printing stories about the mastermind of organized vice. Politicians demanded investigations. Judges whispered about the rise of a new criminal elite. And at the center of their growing obsession stood one man, Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey had the discipline of a soldier and the ambition of a future governor. He understood something law enforcement had never considered, that the mafia was not a collection of street gangs, but an economic system with Luciano as its architect. Dewey didn't just want arrests, he wanted to tear down the structure Luciano built. The pressure tightened. Raids increased. Informants appeared. Businesses linked to Luciano suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Headlines branded him a national threat. And for the first time, Luciano felt the limits of power. He could intimidate gangsters. He could negotiate with bosses. He could silence rivals. But he could not silence the press. He could not intimidate the government. And he could not prevent the public from believing that a single man controlled the entire underworld. The myth of Lucky Luciano's power had made him a legend, and now that same myth was becoming the noose around his neck. The internal strain grew heavier. Some allies distanced themselves, fearing they would be targeted next. Others whispered that Luciano had become too famous, too exposed, too dangerous to stand beside. Even the commission, his proudest creation, began acting cautiously, avoiding decisions that might tie them to him. Luciano saw the shift in their eyes. Power, he realized, could evaporate long before a man actually lost it. Influence faded quietly, subtly, one decision at a time. And fear, the one emotion Luciano recognized instantly in others, had now begun forming inside him. But the most devastating threat of all came from someone he had trusted for years, Vito Genovese. Genovese watched the growing pressure around Luciano not with concern, but with anticipation. Every headline weakening Luciano strengthened his own ambitions. Every legal defeat gave him more room to maneuver. Genovese understood that Luciano was vulnerable not because of his enemies, but because the system he built was beginning to outgrow him. He began forging alliances behind closed doors, whispering that the era of Luciano's leadership was ending. Luciano saw the signs. He recognized the same hunger in Genovese that he once carried himself. And he understood with chilling clarity, the enemy closest to you is the one who waits for your moments of doubt. Outside forces squeezed. Inside threats multiplied. Luciano stood at the center of a kingdom that appeared solid but trembled beneath the surface. He had built a structure meant to prevent chaos, yet chaos was gathering again just beyond the edges of his control. Violence returned in sudden bursts. Laws tightened quickly. Trust dissolved slowly. And for the first time, Luciano understood the terrible irony of becoming king. The higher a man climbs, the more illusions surround him. Control was never absolute. Alliances were never permanent. Power was never secure. And the fear he had carried since childhood, the fear of losing everything he built, now began to surface. Not openly. Not visibly. Luciano would never show it. But inside he recognized a truth he had spent years avoiding. He had mastered men, but he could never master the world around them. The hidden war had begun long before he noticed it. And by the time he understood its scale, it was already too late. Lucky Luciano had always known that power attracted danger. He had known it since his days as a street kid, when a single wrong step could mean a beating or worse. He had known it through his rise, fighting tyrants and outsmarting rivals. But nothing in his past truly prepared him for the moment when the danger finally arrived, not from enemies in the shadows, but from the world he thought he controlled. His fall did not begin with a bullet. It began with something far more devastating: betrayal. By the mid-1930s, Luciano had become the most recognizable mob figure in America. His empire stretched across gambling, prostitution, unions, narcotics, and a network of political influence stronger than any boss before him. But visibility was a double-edged blade. The more powerful he became, the more determined the government became to tear him down. Headlines plastered his name across newspapers. Prosecutors whispered about his downfall. And in courtrooms and police precincts, a new kind of weapon took shape: informants. The arrests began quietly. A brothel madam. A street-level pimp. A bookmaker affiliated with one of Luciano's territories. At first, these seemed like routine police pressure, the kind of noise Luciano could drown out with money, influence, or intimidation. But this time something felt different. These arrests weren't scattered. They were coordinated. And the questioning focused on one subject only: Charlie Lucky. The fear Luciano had carried since childhood, the fear of losing everything, stirred in his chest, not loudly but unmistakably. He sensed a tightening he couldn't yet name, a shift in the environment he couldn't yet see. And then, for the first time, he misjudged the loyalty of the world he built. The turning point came when several women from his prostitution network agreed to testify against him. Some were coerced. Some were promised freedom. Some simply wanted revenge against the men who had mistreated them. But what mattered was that they were willing to speak, willing to break omerta, a code Luciano believed he had reshaped into something stronger than tradition. He had built his empire on the belief that loyalty, if engineered correctly, could outlast fear. He believed incentives were stronger than threats, that shared gain was stronger than inherited obedience. But in the cold light of interrogation rooms, loyalty dissolved faster than he imagined. Dewey's prosecutors collected their testimonies like bricks. Each one added weight to the case against him. Each confession chipped away at the structure he had spent years refining. And the worst part was not the lies told about him, it was the truths. Luciano had been involved in the prostitution racket. He had designed parts of its network. And now, those same structures became the blueprint the government used to crush him. But external pressure alone would not have destroyed him. What truly weakened Luciano's throne came from within. The mafia had always been a place where alliances shifted like wind. Luciano knew this better than anyone. But he had believed that his closest lieutenants, men who rose under his protection, would never abandon him. He was wrong. Some grew afraid. They feared that standing beside Luciano would expose them to prosecutors. Others saw opportunity. If Luciano fell, someone would have to take his place. Ambition makes traitors long before fear does. And in whispered conversations across New York, men who once toasted Luciano's leadership now began imagining a world without him. At the center of this internal betrayal stood Vito Genovese. Though not directly responsible for Luciano's arrest, Genovese was the first to distance himself, the first to position himself as a future leader. He made calls Luciano never approved. He reassured capos that he could protect them better than the man currently under fire. And though Luciano sensed the betrayal, he could do nothing to stop it. His empire had grown too large. His power depended on a structure that now trembled beneath him. When the police finally arrested him at the Roosevelt Hotel in 1936, Luciano walked calmly, denying everything, refusing to reveal fear. But inside something cracked. Not because of the handcuffs. Not because of the cameras. Not because of the headlines calling him the mastermind of organized vice. What broke him was the realization that the collapse had begun long before he was taken into custody. The betrayal had been slow, quiet, predictable in hindsight. The warning signs had been there, nervous glances from associates, stalled conversations, shifting alliances. But Luciano, blinded by the illusion of control, ignored them. He believed he had built something stronger than human nature. And now human nature was knocking down his empire piece by piece. The trial unfolded like a public execution. Witness after witness stepped forward to condemn him. Some cried. Some lied. Some revealed truths they had once sworn to take to their graves. Each testimony struck Luciano with a force no bullet ever could. Omerta shattered in front of him, and with it, the foundation of trust he had once believed was unbreakable. As the walls closed in, the fear Luciano had buried since childhood, the fear of being powerless, finally surfaced. He felt it in the way judges looked at him, in the way jurors whispered, in the way his own men avoided eye contact. He felt it in the way he could no longer predict outcomes, no longer shift the tides, no longer bend reality to his will. This was not just the fall of a mob boss. This was the unraveling of a man who had spent his entire life believing he could outthink the world. He had built an empire on the premise that loyalty could be managed. But loyalty is a living thing, and living things die. When the guilty verdict came, Luciano did not flinch. He had mastered the art of stillness. But inside he felt something collapse. Not his courage, not his rage, but the illusion he had carried since childhood, that he could never lose control. The fall had begun long before the courtroom. The throne had crumbled long before the sentence. And Lucky Luciano, the king who built an empire from nothing, finally understood the cost of believing he could control the uncontrollable. The courtroom was never meant to be a battlefield, yet for Lucky Luciano, it became the place where his empire died. Not with gunfire. Not with betrayal in an alleyway. But under the cold lights of justice, where prosecutors sharpened their words like knives and the state prepared to dismantle the legend he had become. His trial was not simply a legal proceeding, it was a public execution. A staged ritual designed to strip him of power, dignity, and control. Thomas Dewey, the ambitious young prosecutor leading the case, stepped into the arena with a clear objective: to destroy Luciano not as a man but as a myth. Dewey understood the psychology of fear better than most criminals did. He knew the public needed a villain large enough to justify the spectacle. And Luciano, already infamous, already whispered about with awe, was the perfect target. From the moment Dewey announced the indictment, Newspapers erupted. Vice King of America on trial. Luciano controlled every brothel in New York. Public enemy in a silk suit. Each headline chipped away at Luciano's carefully built image of calm authority. For years he had controlled the narrative from the shadows. Now the narrative controlled him. In the courtroom, Dewey performed with precision. He moved like a conductor directing an orchestra of outrage. He summoned witnesses with trembling voices, paraded brothel workers and pimps across the stand, and painted Luciano as a monster who pulled every string in a vast, sinister machine. He did not need to prove Luciano handled day-to-day operations. He only needed to convince the jury that the structure itself pointed back to one man. Luciano sat stone-faced, unmoving, the embodiment of discipline. But inside he felt something shifting, a familiar fear he had spent a lifetime suppressing. The fear of losing control. Witness after witness delivered the blows. Some lied. Some embellished. Some cracked under Dewey's intensity and said whatever they believed would earn them freedom. But the most painful testimonies came from those who had once benefited from Luciano's empire. Men who had eaten at his table, women who had profited under his protection, now pointing at him as though he had been the source of all their misery. Every oath they swore, every accusation they made, was another fracture in the foundation of trust he had built. Luciano had always believed loyalty could be engineered. Now he watched loyalty collapse under pressure like wet paper. Dewey's brilliance was not in proving Luciano guilty, but in reshaping him into a symbol. He depicted him as the embodiment of organized vice, the spider at the center of an invisible web of crime. The more Dewey spoke, the more the courtroom transformed. This was no longer about prostitution charges. It was about the soul of New York. It was about a system the public feared but never fully understood. Luciano wasn't being tried for what he had done. He was being tried for what he represented. And representation is far easier to convict than reality. Even the jury felt the weight of the performance. They watched Dewey dismantle Luciano's empire piece by piece, using the very efficiency Luciano had created as evidence of guilt. What had once made him untouchable, structure, organization, hierarchy, now became the rope tightening around his neck. Dewey argued that such precision could only be the work of a criminal mastermind. Luciano realized too late that the more brilliantly he had built his empire, the easier it became for the state to trace it back to him. Reporters scribbled every detail. Sketch artists captured the tension in his jaw, the stillness in his eyes. Each day he walked into the courtroom he felt the transformation, from king to captive, from architect to accused. He was no longer the man who shaped the underworld. He was the man the underworld whispered about in fear and curiosity. Now the whispers came from journalists and spectators. And they were not whispers of respect. They were whispers of triumph. Because nothing thrilled the public more than watching a king fall. Throughout the trial, Luciano maintained the facade he had mastered: silence, calculation, composure. But the storm inside him grew darker with each passing hour. He could command soldiers. He could orchestrate assassinations. He could manipulate alliances. But he could not control the state. He could not silence the witnesses. And he could not escape the narrative that cast him as the villain. The trial showed him something he had never seen so clearly. Power disappears the moment people stop believing you have it. And Dewey made sure no one believed anymore. The final blow came with Dewey's closing statement, a theatrical condemnation of Luciano as the architect of America's moral collapse. The jury deliberated briefly. When they returned, the verdict was inevitable. Guilty. Guilty on nearly every count. Luciano did not flinch. Not once. He had prepared for bullets, betrayals, wars. But he had never prepared for the humiliation of watching the identity he built crumble in front of strangers. Then came the sentence. 30 to 50 years. The harshest punishment ever given for such charges. A murmur of satisfaction rippled through the courtroom. Dewey stood triumphant. Reporters rushed from their seats to file their stories. And Luciano, escorted away in handcuffs, understood that this was the moment his fear had predicted since childhood. The moment control slipped entirely from his grasp. The king was gone. In his place stood a symbol. A warning. A myth rewritten by the state. He had spent his life believing he could master every variable, every man, every outcome. But now, in the cold echo of the courtroom, he finally faced the truth. Even legends can be dismantled. Even kings can be reduced to headlines. And even Lucky Luciano could not control the world forever. Prison should have ended Lucky Luciano's reign. That is what Thomas Dewey believed. That is what the newspapers promised. That is what the public expected. A king dethroned, a criminal empire decapitated. But power does not vanish simply because steel doors close behind a man. Power, when built correctly, survives distance, silence, and confinement. Luciano discovered this the moment he arrived at Clinton Correctional Facility. Guards watched him with suspicion, inmates watched him with awe, and administrators watched him with discomfort. He carried himself like a man entering a temporary office, not a permanent cell. And in his mind, that was exactly what prison became. A new command center, stripped of comfort but still connected to the empire he had built. But influence without freedom has a price. And for Luciano, that price was psychological. A slow erosion of the identity he had spent his life constructing. From behind bars, his first lifeline was loyalty. The same loyalty he engineered in the streets still operated in whispers and coded messages. Trusted intermediaries visited him regularly. Some brought updates, some brought money, some brought problems only he could solve. Even the warden understood, quietly, that removing Luciano entirely from the outside world was impossible. There were too many men who relied on him. Too many systems that quietly revolved around decisions he used to make effortlessly. Through these channels, Luciano continued directing pieces of the underworld like a general controlling a battlefield he could no longer see. He approved leadership changes, mediated disputes, advised on territory conflicts, and maintained influence over gambling and narcotics networks. In many ways, the empire ran smoother when he was gone, because everyone feared disappointing a man who had built the modern mafia from nothing. But for Luciano, this power came with no satisfaction. He could move men but not walk among them. He could direct operations but not experience their results. He could influence the world, but not inhabit it. He was a ruler without a kingdom. The man who once controlled city blocks now controlled conversations in visitation rooms. The strategist who once navigated alleys, backrooms, and hotel suites now navigated guard rotations and prison schedules. And every time he leaned back on his cell bunk, staring at the cold ceiling, he felt the painful truth tightening around him. Power without presence is a ghost's throne. His closest allies felt the shift. Meyer Lansky, the most loyal of them all, visited when he could. Their conversations were half business, half confession. Lansky updated him on shifting alliances, new rackets, and emerging threats. Luciano listened, advised, analyzed, but inside something ached. The world he once shaped now unfolded without him. Every update reminded him of a life moving forward while he remained locked in a timeless vacuum. Frank Costello too visited often. He maintained political influence in New York, smoothing conflicts and preserving the stability Luciano had created. But even Costello's presence carried a sting. Luciano could feel the future pulling Costello forward while he, the architect of the system, remained trapped behind steel bars. He felt himself aging in silence. And that silence carried a new kind of fear. Not the fear of losing control but the fear of becoming irrelevant. He had feared losing power his entire life. But prison introduced him to a deeper terror. The possibility that his empire could evolve without him, that his name might fade from meetings, that younger gangsters might speak of him as a relic rather than a ruler. That fear grew slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. It surfaced when a message from outside lacked urgency. It surfaced when disputes were settled without consulting him. It surfaced when rumors spread that some bosses believed his leadership was finished. For the first time, Luciano understood what it meant to be forgotten before you were dead. He tried to counter this fear the only way he knew, by staying indispensable. He offered advice no one else could. He warned against alliances others didn't yet see as dangerous. And he reminded his allies, subtly, strategically, that the world they now ruled existed because of him. Still, the erosion continued. Younger bosses began rising. Men who had never shaken Luciano's hand now commanded crews. They respected him, yes, but from a distance. Respect without dependence is a fragile form of loyalty. And Luciano knew it. He watched as the commission, his creation, continued functioning efficiently. Disputes were resolved. Territory lines held firm. Profits remained strong. His absence had not broken the system. And that was the most painful truth of all. He had built a world that no longer needed him. At night, in the quiet hours when the prison corridors echoed with distant footsteps, Luciano replayed his life, not the violence, not the betrayals, but the belief that he could shape destiny through sheer will. He remembered the street kid who feared losing control. He remembered the young gangster who swore he'd never be powerless again. He remembered the king who believed power could be constructed like architecture. Now he sat in a cell, realizing that even the greatest architecture erodes. But even as doubt gnawed at him, one truth remained: Luciano still mattered. His voice, though distant, still guided decisions. His name still carried weight. His allies still feared disappointing him. And his enemies still believed he could influence events from the shadows. He was no longer the king. But he was still the memory of a king. And memory, if strong enough, can shape men as powerfully as presence. Yet deep inside the fear continued to evolve. Not the fear of losing the empire. Not the fear of losing control. But the fear that one day his voice would stop being heard, his influence would stop being felt, and his name would become nothing more than a story told by men who had never truly known him. The king was alive. But the throne was fading. And Lucky Luciano felt the cold breath of irrelevance brushing the back of his neck. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship onto Italian soil in 1946, he knew instantly that exile was not freedom, it was a slow erasure. The United States had expelled him like a contagion, and Italy received him like a stranger. The country of his birth no longer felt like home. Sicily was a childhood memory blurred by poverty. Naples, where he was forced to settle, welcomed him with the cold curiosity reserved for legends out of place. For the first time in his life, Luciano had power but no territory, influence but no domain, reputation but no throne. He walked the streets of Naples with the grace of a man pretending not to feel the emptiness beneath his feet. Locals whispered his name but few approached. Some admired him as an American-style outlaw, others feared he would bring trouble from across the ocean. But the truth was simpler. Luciano had returned as a king without a kingdom. Still, instinct drove him to rebuild. He met with local figures, sensing weakness and opportunity. He attempted to insert himself into small smuggling rings, the black market networks that thrived in post-war Italy. Yet he immediately recognized the difference. American crime was an industry, Italian crime was a patchwork of old loyalties and rigid hierarchies. He didn't speak its language anymore. His strategies, brilliant in New York, were viewed as foreign here. He was a guest in a world that should have been familiar. But he refused to fade. Coded messages continued flowing between Naples and New York. Lansky visited when he could, bringing updates from the underworld Luciano once shaped with his bare hands. Their conversations were bittersweet, half business, half reminders of a world Luciano still longed for. Lansky spoke of new ventures, new alliances, new bosses. Luciano listened, offering advice, but deep inside he felt the truth tightening around his aging heart. His world was moving on without him. What haunted him wasn't the loss of control. It was the loss of relevance. The commission still operated. Crews still earned. New leaders still rose. And the empire he built still lived, but it no longer belonged to him. He was an architect forced to watch younger men inhabit the house he designed. Even his closest allies, though loyal, no longer needed him. His strategic mind, once the engine of the American mafia, was now a relic murmured about respectfully, not relied upon. Then came Cuba, his last real attempt to breathe life into a fading legacy. In the late 1940s, Lansky helped arrange for Luciano to relocate to Havana, where casinos, politicians and gangsters created a paradise for criminal enterprise. For a moment, Luciano felt alive again. The warm air, the clatter of dice, the smoke-filled rooms, it echoed the world he once ruled. He moved through Havana with a spark that had been absent since exile. Old allies greeted him like a returning monarch. Money flowed, plans formed, and for a brief flicker in time, Luciano dared to believe he could rebuild. But the FBI learned of his presence. Pressure mounted on the Cuban government. And once again Luciano became a problem too large to ignore. He was ordered out. Deported again. Forced back to Italy, where the shadows felt longer and the silence heavier. Returned to Naples, he found the city unchanged, but he was not. Age crept into him like a quiet intruder. The once sharp eyes dulled under exhaustion. His stride slowed. His nights stretched longer, haunted by memories rather than ambition. He still met visitors, still gave advice, still held the remnants of his authority, but each year fewer men came seeking his guidance. The younger generation respected the myth, not the man. They quoted him, honored him, referenced him, but they did not need him. And that was the deepest cut of all. Luciano's entire life had been built around control, controlling rivals, controlling chaos, controlling the fragile threads of loyalty. But age revealed a truth he had never prepared for. The greatest loss is not control, but meaning. In quiet evenings, he sat by his window overlooking the Bay of Naples, listening to the distant hum of the city. He reflected not on violence or victories but on choices, the alliances he forged, the men he trusted, the betrayals that shaped him. He wondered whether he had built an empire or merely arranged temporary loyalties into a structure destined to evolve without him. His health declined steadily. Heart problems grew worse. His body, once forged by the hardness of the streets, now betrayed him the way men once had. He continued meeting with visitors, businessmen, criminals, curious admirers, but the meetings grew shorter. His questions grew slower. His voice carried less command. Yet even in decline he never stopped observing. Never stopped calculating. Never stopped fearing the one thing he could not strategize against: oblivion. He watched the world change. Organized crime expanded globally, evolving into something far larger than the system he built. New faces replaced old ones. New methods replaced old rackets. Luciano had created the blueprint, but the builders who followed no longer needed the architect. In those final years, the man who once ruled New York lived like a ghost drifting through a city that was never truly his. He felt suspended, not alive in the world he built, not accepted in the world he returned to. A man with no home, no throne, and no place to rest his legacy. On January 26, 1962, Luciano fell to the ground at Naples International Airport after a meeting about a film based on his life. As he lay there, breath fading, a strange truth settled over him. He had become a story, a legend, a memory, not a ruler, not a force. Not the man who once commanded the fear of an entire country. In death he finally understood what exile had already taught him. A king can lose his kingdom, but losing his place in history, that is the fear that haunts him the longest. When Lucky Luciano died in Naples, the world's underworld did not crumble. No family collapsed, no war erupted, no empire vanished overnight. Instead, something far more revealing happened. Everything continued. Operations ran smoothly. The commission held meetings. Bosses argued, cooperated, and reorganized just as they had for decades. And in that eerie continuity lay the secret to Luciano's legacy. He had built a system so strong, so adaptable, so fundamentally sound that it survived without the man who created it. That was both his triumph and his tragedy. Luciano modernized organized crime in a way no predecessor dreamed of. Before him, the mafia operated like warring tribes, bound by old country rules that suffocated more than protected. Violence solved everything and violence solved nothing. Bosses ruled by fear but offered no vision. The underworld churned in cycles of conflict, as unstable as the slums that housed it. Luciano changed all of that, quietly at first, then surgically, then with a force that redefined the American criminal landscape. His first innovation was simple but transformative. He treated crime as business. He replaced impulsive violence with calculated strategy. He streamlined rackets, diversified operations, and introduced organizational models that mirrored legitimate corporations. No longer were gangsters mere street predators. Under Luciano they became administrators, investors, logisticians. Every racket, gambling, narcotics, prostitution, labor unions, became an industry with divisions, managers, and rules. This shift allowed the mafia to grow beyond neighborhoods and cities. It became national, then international. Luciano had not simply built an empire, he had built an economy. But his most enduring creation was not a racket at all, it was the commission. To prevent another era of bloodshed like the Castellamarese War, Luciano designed a governing council where bosses shared power rather than fought for it. The commission regulated disputes, approved major decisions, and served as the stabilizing force the mafia had lacked for decades. It was revolutionary, the underworld's first attempt at democracy, however shadowed and self-serving. Long after Luciano lost power, long after he died in exile in a foreign land, the commission remained the mafia's political spine. Even when weakened, even when fragmented, even when targeted by law enforcement, its structure persisted. Luciano's imprint was never erased. And yet, behind every success lay a paradox that gnawed at him until the end. Luciano feared losing control more than anything. He feared irrelevance. He feared watching the world he built slip through his fingers. But the system he engineered, the one meant to preserve his vision, was the same system that made him replaceable. The very strength of his design proved his greatest insecurity. Because once a structure is strong enough, it no longer needs the architect. Luciano learned this brutally in prison and exile. The machine he built kept moving without him, guided by the men he had elevated. Frank Costello maintained political influence. Lansky expanded financial operations. Genovese waited hungrily for openings. And when those men made decisions without consulting him, the truth stung deeper than any betrayal. His empire was functioning exactly as he had designed it to, which meant he was no longer essential. This is the psychological contradiction of his legacy. Luciano wanted power, absolute, unquestioned, undeniable. But to build lasting power, he had to create a system broader than himself. He had to decentralize authority, to distribute control, to empower others. And the moment he did, he ensured that his empire would one day outgrow him. Still, his influence stretched far beyond New York, long after his voice faded. The Cuban casinos carried his fingerprints. The Las Vegas blueprint carried his ambition. The heroin routes through Europe and the Middle East carried structures he helped implement. Even the post-war Italian mafia absorbed his model, replacing rustic clan feuds with organized networks inspired by American efficiency. Luciano did not just modernize the mafia, he globalized it. Yet when historians speak of him, they often focus on his criminal brilliance, not the emotional truth beneath it. Luciano built systems because he feared uncertainty. He built alliances because he feared betrayal. He built order because he feared the chaos that shaped his childhood. Every innovation was a shield against the vulnerability he carried from his earliest days on the Lower East Side. Power to Luciano was not luxury. It was protection. Control was not arrogance. It was survival. And his legacy, though celebrated for its genius, is also a testament to the insecurity that fueled it. Even in exile, far removed from the game, the criminal world continued whispering his name. Not because he still influenced decisions, but because he had influenced the architecture. Men who never met him followed rules he created. Bosses who never heard his voice sat in seats he designed. Wars were prevented because of his vision. Profits flowed because of his structure. But the whispers also carried something else, a soft, haunting recognition that Luciano never heard himself. He had become larger than his fears. Larger than his failures. Larger than the insecurities that drove him. He had become an idea. And ideas do not die. In the final years of his life as he sat alone in Naples, Luciano likely sensed this duality. He had lost his throne but not his influence. He had been forgotten in daily operations, yet immortalized in legacy. He had feared irrelevance, yet created a system that guaranteed he would never fully disappear. This is the bittersweet core of his story. Lucky Luciano built an empire to protect himself from chaos, and in doing so he built a legacy that protected the mafia from chaos long after he was gone. His genius forged the modern underworld. His insecurity shaped its evolution. And his legacy stands as both a monument to his brilliance and a mirror reflecting the fear that drove him. Lucky Luciano lived a life surrounded by danger, betrayal, and death. But through it all, through street fights, gang wars, assassination attempts, and courtrooms hungry to see him fall, he carried a secret truth. He did not fear dying. Death was familiar, predictable, almost comforting in its certainty. What Luciano feared from childhood to exile was something far more terrifying: losing control. Control was the invisible thread woven through every chapter of his life. It was the shield he built in the schoolyards of the Lower East Side, the engine that fueled his rise through the criminal ranks, and the force that shaped his empire into the most organized syndicate America had ever seen. He controlled chaos. He controlled men. He controlled fear itself. And in that control he found security, the one thing he had been denied as a poor immigrant boy. But the tragedy of Luciano's story is that the very thing he feared was the very thing he could never escape. As he rose, so did the forces determined to dismantle him. As he built, so did the cracks beneath his feet widen. As he organized the mafia learned how to live without him. The invincible Godfather, the mastermind behind the commission, the architect of modern organized crime, was ultimately undone not by rivals, not by bullets, but by the slow erosion of the one power he valued most, the ability to shape his world. In the courtroom, stripped of influence, facing witnesses who once swore loyalty to him, Luciano experienced the collapse of his greatest illusion. His empire was not as solid as he believed. His loyalty methods were not as unbreakable as he hoped. The system he crafted to give him everlasting control became the very structure that proved he was replaceable. His greatest fear became his reality. And prison, far more than the trial, cemented that truth. Luciano could still whisper orders, send signals, advise allies, but the world continued without him. The machine functioned. The families adapted. The commission endured. He had built something permanent, but permanence came with a cruel irony. A system strong enough to outlast its creator has no need for its creator. Exile only deepened the wound. In Naples and later in Havana, Luciano tried to reclaim fragments of influence. But age, distance, and time turned him into a spectator of a world he once commanded. His empire had become a living organism, evolving without his input, thriving without his guidance. He had built a kingdom, and then watched it forget its king. In the quiet spaces of his final years, Luciano came face to face with the truth he had outrun for decades. The fear that had shaped him as a child and empowered him as a man was also the fear that defined his end. He was not haunted by the men he killed. Not haunted by the laws he broke. Not even haunted by the betrayals he endured. He was haunted by irrelevance. Haunted by the realization that power is temporary. That loyalty is conditional. That control, no matter how carefully engineered, eventually slips away. The myth of Lucky Luciano, the godfather who could not be touched, is a myth built on the assumption that power protects. But the truth, the deeper truth, is this: power isolates. Power fractures. Power exposes every vulnerability a man tries to hide. Luciano tried to outthink fear. He tried to build beyond fear. He tried to dominate fear by constructing a system so strong it would outlive him. And it did. But in outliving him, it revealed what he could never accept. He was mortal. He was replaceable. He was human. This is the final irony of his story. The most powerful criminal in American history did not fear the gun. He feared becoming forgotten. And yet he was not forgotten. He became legend. He became foundation. He became the architect whose blueprint still shapes the underworld. But legend is not control. Legacy is not command. In the end, Lucky Luciano left behind an empire that no longer needed him, and that absence, that loss of control, was the one fate he had feared all along.